We've all had one of those jobs where we're just overworked and underpaid. But I want you to imagine for a second that you're a UPS delivery driver. You're out making your rounds, and then one day an Amazon Prime van comes whipping up in front of you. They cut you off, like kidnapping style from a Hollywood movie. They take you out of your van, they throw you into their van, and now you're making deliveries for them. Well, unfortunately, this was a reality for all too many during the late 18th century and early 19th century. This is one of many things that a merchant sailor would have had to worry about during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. At this time, the British were practicing a thing called impressment, otherwise known as press gang. And this was not a new thing for the British. They'd been doing this since the 13th century, and they did this just to take and fill the numbers for their navy. Between the years of 1793 and 1812, the British Navy needed to increase their numbers, and they needed to increase their numbers fast. And they needed more ships, so they increased it from 135 to 584 ships. But this also meant that they were going to need a lot more sailors. They were going to have to go from 36,000 to 114,000 sailors. In contrast, the British Merchant Marines in 1792 were already around 118,000 strong. So what did the Royal Navy decide to do to take and get their numbers up? Well, they hired groups of men to go around and impress people. Not in the good way, though. They would go around and they would look for people that were eligible for enlistment. Yes, all of those are air quotes, because none of this was on the up and up. They would literally take and go around, and if you were laying on the street passed out, they would just pick you up. They would even go into pubs and they would supply you a drink all night long. And at the end of the night, you weren't all that great, you probably passed out, and the next morning you would wake up and you'd be on a ship out at sea. As if being forced into the Royal Navy wasn't bad enough already, the ships would take excruciatingly long voyages, so you wouldn't see home for a while. The pay on the ship was low, and punishment was hard. And speaking of pay, they would often hold your pay for around 6 months. This was to deter you from deserting them. Being a civilian on a merchant ship was a lot better than the Royal Navy. I'm not saying it was great, but it was still better. The ship's companies understood that if they wanted a successful delivery of the goods, then they needed to treat the crew better, they needed to pay the crew better. So all of these things were going against the Royal Navy when they were trying to take and recruit people. The problem with impressment, other than for the obvious, is the British didn't just stick to taking other Brits.
Oi.
They would stop merchant ships at sea that were from neutral countries. So during this time, you had the Napoleonic Wars, but not everybody was involved. And they would start forcing their sailors onto their ships. And unfortunately, it wasn't legal, but it wasn't illegal either. A lot of times the higher-ups would just overlook it because it was helping fill the numbers in the Navy. During the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the British and the French tried to destroy each other in any way they could. So they took to economic warfare as being one of the ways. And what they did was they enacted edicts on each other to take and prevent trade. But the problem is that this didn't just hurt the British and the French. It actually hurt neutral countries just trying to take and make a living. And the way that some of these were worded actually really hurt merchant vessels. The British enacted an edict that said that before you could take and make delivery to Europe, you had to stop into one of their ports, pay taxes on all of your goods, and then you could take and actually make the delivery to the country you were trying to go to. Now we come to the part of the show where we find out what Charlie wanted. Charlie asked to be a merchant marine, sailing during the Napoleonic Wars. He wanted to be 25 years old and a male. We find Charlie standing on a dock in New York. He's already done many trips across the Atlantic as a merchant for the United States. He transports goods like cotton and tobacco over to Spain. These voyages would have taken him around 6 weeks just to go one way. So he would not see home for a few months. Before the voyage could even start though, the captain would have to acquire a license. This license allowed them to actually do the trading. Why did merchant ships have to get a license just to be able to trade? At this point in time, the British were actually blockading any ports in Europe that didn't fly a British flag. And these licenses were not easy to come by. There's reports of people trying several times to get a license, being rejected, and then trying again and for no reason at all, managing to get the license. And the licenses were very unpopular. You would think, okay, I buy one license, I'm now good to take and sail back and forth as many times as I want. Think like a driver's license. Unfortunately, no. The way it was set up was one license, one ship, one trip. So in 1807, the British actually changed this, and they changed it to where the one license would cover several ships and several voyages for a certain time period. So what would happen? Well, much like a teenager buying a fake license, people started to do that. They would purchase these fake licenses so that they could get around having to pay the British for it. Many merchant ships that were from the countries that were at war, they would start to fly neutral flags and carry these fake licenses just so they could take and get around the blockade. These trade licenses were meant to offer safe passage for the merchant vessels to their destination. But unfortunately, the British don't always care for the rules, especially the rules they put into place themselves. They would often take to stopping the ships at sea and impressing the sailors onto their ships. Charlie's now been at sea for weeks, and life was difficult. Living in cramped living conditions, dealing with poor quality of food. If that wasn't the problem, he would have to deal with the possibility of there not being any wind and starving on sea. If that wasn't an issue, he would have to deal with a storm possibly sinking the ship. And all else fails, scurvy. Scurvy is nothing more than lack of vitamin C in your diet. It'll lead to your joints swelling, your teeth falling out, and if it goes untreated, it'll lead to your death. Even though Charlie and the crew may have been days away from landfall, the Royal Navy didn't look at it that way. What they seen was bodies, and they decided they were going to take these bodies, and Charlie and the men would have been at sea for even longer, months possibly. And life on the Royal Navy ships was hard. They did not spare the rod, so to speak. They would often take and flog, and it was done with the cat o' nine tails. You probably have heard of it. These floggings were done in front of the whole crew to take and help implement the idea of punishment. If he tried to take and start a mutiny, he would be hung. The British practiced this act of impressment so much that the United States actually cited it as one of the reasons for the start of the War of 1812. Between 1793 and 1812, the British impressed over 15,000 American merchant sailors. Now, this isn't to say that the US was actually clear of any wrongdoing, because the US practiced this as well. They just didn't keep as meticulous records as the British did. The British actually didn't even stop doing impressments until 1850s, and even then, they still kind of continued it on, but it was illegal, but, wouldn't that ever stop the British from doing anything? We may never actually truly know how many men were actually impressed into the Royal Navy. This topic was suggested by Charlie Hickmott. He has a podcast called Everything and Nothing. Highly recommend checking it out. I want to thank you all for watching, and I want to thank the patrons. And I hope that your next trip at sea is maybe, a little bit nicer than what was happening in the Napoleonic Wars.